Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to welcome you to the Mr. Brain channel. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. But before that, please consider giving us a like. I would truly appreciate it, and let me know from where you are watching my videos. I hadn't spent much time with my dad since Mom died. Truthfully, I hadn't spent much time with him before that either. Cal Morgan was the kind of father you admired from a distance, and that distance usually felt like the span of a continent. He spent most of my childhood overseas, a career Army Ranger known for his ability to survive in conditions most people wouldn't willingly visit. When he finally retired, he didn't settle down. Instead, he chose to teach wilderness navigation and survival. My mother loved him, though I'm not sure she ever fully understood him. After she passed, we became two people orbiting a painful silence. When he suggested a week-long trek through Wyoming's Wind River Range, I almost said no. But something in his voice, a gentle vulnerability I hadn't heard before, pushed me to agree. I flew in from Seattle, met him in Riverton, and we drove out to the Elkhart Park trailhead on a cold September morning. The leaves had already turned a brittle yellow, and a ranger stopped us briefly before we headed out, warning us of bear sightings and an early snowfall. Neither seemed to bother Dad. The first couple of days went by without issue, aside from my growing irritation with the terrain and weather. By day 3, we'd crossed Island Lake and were making our way toward Bonneville Basin. My muscles ached, the straps of my pack chafing my shoulders. But I kept pace with my father. He moved ahead of me with practiced ease, constantly scanning the horizon as if expecting trouble. It was almost noon when Dad paused on the trail, staring intently into a stand of lodgepole pines. "Hold up," he said quietly. "What is it?" "Game trail. Curious where it leads." I sighed loudly enough for him to hear, but he ignored it and stepped off the main path. The trail he chose was barely more than a hint of disturbed grass, winding through a grove so dense that branches scratched at our jackets. I swallowed my complaints, following closely behind. Less than a quarter-mile later, we found it. My stomach twisted into a tight knot. There, tucked against a rocky slope beneath twisted, dying pines, stood a crude shelter. The walls were built from elk antlers, cracked bones, and rotting wood, every piece weathered by exposure. It looked like something built by someone desperate or insane. A heap of sharp angles and organic debris. My eyes trailed across the twisted shapes, and nausea rose in my throat as I realized many of the bones had been gnawed. "Dad," my voice barely carried above a whisper. He didn't respond. Instead, he knelt and ran his fingers slowly over one of the wooden support beams. Then he abruptly recoiled, eyes narrowing. I stepped closer, feeling the chill seep through my coat. Embedded in the grain of the weathered wood were teeth, human teeth, ivory white to yellowed, roots intact, forced deep into the timber. I could feel my pulse quicken, breath fogging in short bursts. "Dad, we shouldn't be here." He nodded, his eyes darkening. Without another word, he turned away and walked back the way we'd come, faster than before. I hurried after him, glancing back only once at the terrible shelter. It seemed to mock our intrusion, a dark, jagged shape standing stark against the thin forest. We hiked another mile down a steep slope toward a rushing glacial stream before Dad finally stopped. We set camp in silence, working quickly as dusk seeped across the landscape. Dad spoke little, only giving brief instructions. His eyes seemed focused on something far away, something only he could see. Nightfall came rapidly, bringing with it a bitter wind. I zipped myself into the tent and stared at the thin nylon walls, listening to the stream hiss and churn nearby. Sleep came in restless fits, and it felt like only moments passed before a sound woke me. Crunch, crunch. I sat upright, my pulse pounding in my ears. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, like footsteps circling above our camp. I turned toward Dad. He was already awake, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the tent. He lifted a finger to his lips and shook his head slowly. Crunch, snap. Whatever it was circled us twice before moving away. When silence finally returned, neither of us moved, waiting desperately for dawn. The morning light brought relief, but also dread. Our camp looked different. Small things, scattered items shifted subtly from where we'd left them. Dad stood at the edge of our clearing, his posture stiff. I approached quietly, then followed his gaze down to the ground. Resting on a flat rock placed there intentionally was a pair of military-issued jungle boots. Worn down, split at the soles, they looked as though they'd spent years in these mountains. Dad knelt slowly, staring at them. His face was pale. "What is it?" I asked, though part of me didn't want the answer. He exhaled slowly, his voice tight. "These belonged to someone I knew. Sergeant Bill Navarro. He disappeared up here maybe 6 years back. They never found him." The silence that followed was heavier than any we'd shared before. I stared at those boots, trying to ignore the way the wind now felt colder, the trees more oppressive. "Dad," I finally whispered, "I think someone wants us gone." His eyes met mine, colder and more haunted than I'd ever seen them. "No, Rachel. I think someone wants us to stay." My father didn't speak again until mid-morning. We sat quietly by the small fire he'd built, sipping bitter coffee. My nerves felt frayed from lack of sleep and the creeping unease that had taken hold. I stared into the smoldering embers, hoping he'd break the silence first. Finally he spoke, his voice heavy with something I couldn't quite identify. "Rachel, about those boots." I glanced up. He was looking directly at me, his expression tense, the lines of his face deeper than I remembered. "They were Bill Navarro's," he continued. Voice hushed as if even the trees might overhear. "He disappeared hiking solo up here back in 2019. No traces, no leads, nothing. Search and rescue teams combed these mountains for weeks. I knew Bill well enough to recognize those boots anywhere." "How can you be sure?" My question felt foolish even as I said it. "The laces," he said softly. "Bill always used red paracord. It was his way of being prepared. I taught him that." I swallowed hard, feeling the forest around us tighten like a snare. "Maybe someone found them. Maybe it's a coincidence." He shook his head slowly. "I don't think so. Whatever we stumbled into here, it's not random." The silence fell between us again, oppressive. We broke camp in tense quiet, packing swiftly. Every sound felt louder. The crunch of pine needles beneath our boots, the rustling of gear, our breaths sharp and shallow. The weight of our packs grew heavier, as if the air itself resisted our movement. By midday, we'd moved a few miles south along the trail. I tried to focus on the terrain, the vast granite faces, the sharp contrast of alpine grass against patches of snow. But my eyes kept drifting back up the ridge toward the shelter we'd left behind. Then, around mid-afternoon, Dad stopped abruptly and pointed into the distance. A thin ribbon of smoke curled upward against a pale, cloudy sky somewhere near the ridge we'd left earlier. It rose and dissipated gently, far too controlled to be accidental, yet oddly faint, barely visible. "Is someone camping up there?" I asked, though I doubted my own suggestion. "Too remote," Dad murmured, eyes narrowed. "Not a good spot, no water source nearby." We watched it silently for another few minutes. Eventually the smoke faded entirely, leaving no trace it had ever existed. Dad's jaw tightened. "Let's keep moving." Evening descended quickly, blanketing the valley in shades of gray and blue. Dad chose a new campsite cautiously, selecting an open area with good visibility. We built a larger fire this time, arranging rocks carefully around its perimeter. He retrieved a hatchet and a flare gun from his pack, placing both within easy reach. His preparation only heightened my anxiety. We barely spoke through dinner, ears straining to pick up anything unusual. Just as the shadows deepened, I moved down a shallow slope to gather water from a stream. My breath caught when something shifted in my peripheral vision. I froze, then slowly raised my eyes toward the ridge above us. A figure stood outlined against the fading twilight, tall, gaunt, and angular. Its form was distorted by the dimness, but clearly not an animal. Its arms hung unnaturally long at its sides, torso impossibly thinned. I stood paralyzed, heart hammering in my chest. "Dad," I whispered urgently, barely audible. "Up on the ridge." He appeared next to me, following my gaze upward, but the figure was already gone. Only empty space remained, framed by rocks and pines. I felt a deep chill settle into my bones. "I saw it," I insisted softly, fighting back the tremor in my voice. "Someone was watching us." He nodded gravely. "I believe you." We hurried back to camp, building the fire higher, feeding it dry wood until flames leaped and crackled. I pulled my jacket tightly around my shoulders, scanning the dark edges of our campsite. As night fell fully, dread pressed in around us, heavy and tangible. Then we heard it, footsteps again, slow and deliberate, circling just beyond the fire's glow. Dad gripped the hatchet tightly, jaw clenched. The steps moved with precision, pausing occasionally as if measuring our reactions. We sat frozen, listening, barely breathing. Suddenly, something landed near the fire, making me jump. I stared in horror as Dad leaned forward, lifting the object from the ground. His fingers trembled slightly as he held it up to the firelight, an army patch. His face drained of color as he turned it over. He traced the emblem gently with his thumb, his breathing ragged, eyes glassy with emotion. "This is from my old unit," he whispered. His voice cracked on the words, grief and confusion spilling from him openly for the first time in my life. "This belonged to one of the others, one of the missing." My stomach churned. "How many went missing, Dad?" He exhaled deeply, fighting back visible pain. "4. 4 soldiers from my unit vanished up here between 2009 and 2018. Always alone, always without a trace." I felt tears stinging my eyes, the reality of our situation hitting me with terrifying clarity. "Something followed us from that shelter, something that knows you." Before he could respond, a new sound froze us both. Directly behind the tent, close enough to touch the thin nylon walls, came deep, rhythmic breathing. It sounded wet and heavy, inhaling long and slow, as if taking us in, savoring our presence. Dad lifted his finger silently, eyes locked on mine, shaking his head once. Neither of us dared to move, barely breathing ourselves. We waited, muscles taut, minds frantically searching for escape, until eventually the sound stopped. But the silence that replaced it was infinitely worse. When everything essential was secured, Dad reached into his pack and pulled out a small canister of kerosene, one he'd carried for emergencies. In swift, practiced motions, he began rigging a crude tripwire between 2 narrow trees near our campsite's edge. He laid fishing line at ankle height, barely visible, securing it tightly between 2 sticks that supported the canister above a small prepared mound of tinder. "What's this?" I whispered sharply, confused. "A warning, or a distraction." His tone was flat, resolute. "When this trips, it'll flash up quick. If something's following us, we'll have a few seconds." I swallowed hard, realizing this wasn't just caution. He was setting a trap. Whatever stalked us wasn't just some wild animal. It was something else entirely, something calculated. We extinguished most of our fire, leaving just glowing embers, and waited in the bitter chill. The minutes dragged on torturously, every snapping twig or rustling branch jolting my heart. Eventually, I saw Dad glance at his watch, frowning deeply. "It's past 1, he whispered. "Let's move." We hoisted our packs and took our first cautious steps away from camp, barely daring to breathe. The forest around us felt suffocating, every shadow hiding unseen threats. We'd made it maybe 50 yards following our carefully marked GPS route through dense trees, when a sharp crack echoed from behind. An instant later, a bright orange flash erupted in the darkness, briefly illuminating the trees like a violent sunrise. We both spun around, eyes widening in horror, as a figure emerged through the flames, briefly silhouetted by the flickering blaze. My heart lurched. It was impossibly tall, emaciated, with elongated limbs and pale, ash-covered skin that stretched over prominent bones. Its jaw hung grotesquely wide, an open maw of blackness, and even in that split-second glimpse, I could tell there were no eyes, only empty hollows. "Run," Dad shouted, grabbing my arm and yanking me forward. Adrenaline surged through me, obliterating the pain in my legs as we plunged into a panicked sprint. Branches clawed at my face and neck. I stumbled repeatedly, nearly losing my footing on slick rocks and tangled undergrowth. Dad's breathing was harsh beside me, matching mine in sheer desperation. Behind us, crashing steps echoed relentlessly, heavy and deliberate, drawing closer with every stride. I slipped hard, my knee slamming onto shale, sending sharp pain slicing upward through my body. Dad hauled me up without pause, his grip iron tight. We pushed forward blindly, driven by fear and instinct alone. Then the whistle started. Sharp, shrill sounds piercing the night. They echoed strangely, distorted, almost mimicking human voices but twisted into something far worse. It felt as though they came from every direction at once, impossible to pinpoint. My throat tightened in panic. The trail blurred ahead, lit dimly by our shaking headlamps. The figure behind us crashed through brush and branches, persistent but strangely measured, matching our frantic pace as if it were playing a twisted game. My lungs burned, each breath ragged, every step becoming heavier and slower. Still, Dad pushed us forward, unwilling to slow down. Just as the sky began to lighten, faint hints of dawn illuminating the peaks around us, the terrain leveled out. A surge of hope jolted me. We were close to the parking area, our truck parked safely just beyond this final stretch of wilderness. "Dad," I gasped, voice raw from exertion. "We're almost there." We stumbled together, our pace frantic and uneven, desperate to reach the dirt lot ahead. Behind us, the creature's pursuit had slowed, the whistles fading to silence, replaced only by distant, eerie cracking sounds. Neither of us dared to look back. Finally, our boots met packed dirt, familiar ground beneath us at last. We reached the truck in seconds, hands shaking violently as Dad fumbled the keys, finally unlocking the doors. I practically threw myself inside, chest heaving painfully. Dad started the engine immediately, spinning gravel as we pulled away, racing down the narrow road. Neither of us spoke during the drive back toward civilization. Exhaustion seeped into my bones and I stared out the passenger window, seeing nothing but dark trees and shadowed mountains. When we reached the ranger station an hour later, the sun was fully risen, bathing the world in an oddly normal light that felt surreal. The rangers listened carefully to Dad's recounting, disbelief and concern mixing on their faces. 2 days later, a search team returned to the coordinates we provided. Dad and I waited in anxious silence for their report, but what they found offered no relief, only further confusion. The entire ridge had been burned black. Charred trees and scorched rocks stretched as far as they could see. The strange bone and wood shelter, the boots, the signs of whatever had stalked us, nothing remained. Not a single piece of evidence survived the flames. We never returned to the Wind River Range. Dad stopped guiding trips, retreating further into himself. He began writing letters, quiet apologies to the families of those lost men from his old unit. He never shared their replies, if there ever were any. Years later, I framed that army patch, sealing it carefully beneath glass. Below it, in small, precise handwriting, I noted the GPS coordinates we'd marked. Blood Ridge, a place now wiped from official maps, existing only in our memories and nightmares. I always knew Snowshoe Gulch had a reputation. Most trails around Flathead National Forest do, especially if you talk to the locals who've spent their lives hunting, fishing, and guiding tourists through these mountains. Growing up here, I'd heard the whispers, the quiet warnings about places that didn't feel quite right. My brother Eli and I would joke about it sometimes, those strange stories, calling them campfire talk or old-timer paranoia. But neither of us ever laughed too loud, and we always watched the tree line carefully when the shadows stretched long. When Eli went missing with his client, Eric H. Halstead, in early January of 2019, those whispers came back louder and colder. 3 days after they failed to return, Flathead County Search and Rescue was out combing the trails, trying to pick up their tracks. I didn't join the main group, even though they'd asked me. Instead, I teamed up with Nathan Two Feathers, a Blackfeet tracker I'd known since we were kids, and two other volunteers, Deputy Greg Weller from the Sheriff's Department and Jesse, a local who'd been riding snowmobiles through these forests almost as long as I had. We left before sunrise, engines cutting through the silence, headlights piercing the heavy snow flurries that rolled over the mountains. It took 3 hours of riding before we finally reached the edge of Snowshoe Gulch. It wasn't a place meant for snowmobiling, too steep, too narrow, and notoriously unpredictable, but Eli's GPS had pinged near here before going silent. Nathan slowed ahead of me, signaling us to stop. His expression was solemn beneath the fur-lined hood of his parka. "This place feels wrong," Nathan said simply, killing his engine. He gazed through the trees, eyes narrowed. "My grandfather refused to hunt here. He called it a place the forest wouldn't take back." Greg chuckled nervously, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, Two Feathers. Let's not spook ourselves before we even get started." Nathan ignored him and looked straight at me. "Caleb, if your brother came here willingly, he had a good reason. Eli was smart." I nodded silently. Eli was experienced, careful. If he'd come here, something had drawn him. We rode slowly into the gulch, engines growling as we navigated fallen trees and drifts higher than our waists. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. No birdsong, no rustling of branches, just a thick, oppressive silence. Jesse spotted the sleds first, pointing wordlessly. They sat in a small clearing, arranged nose to nose in a perfect circle, headlights still faintly glowing beneath snowdrifts. "Why would they park like that?" Jesse whispered, unease creeping into his voice. I moved closer, brushing snow from the seat of Eli's sled. His keys were still in the ignition. The fuel gauge read half full. It made no sense. Eli was meticulous, disciplined. He wouldn't abandon his machine in such an odd formation. Nathan crouched by the tracks leading away from the snowmobiles. "2 sets of prints," he said. "No panic, no running." They walked. We followed the footprints carefully through the snow until they ended abruptly at a frozen creek. Greg stepped cautiously onto the ice, shining his flashlight through the layers. Solid, thick, no cracks, no signs of someone breaking through. "Impossible," Greg muttered, disbelief coloring his voice. "Tracks don't just disappear." Nathan stood quietly, studying the trees above the creek, his breath clouding in the fading daylight. "Something erased them. This place doesn't belong to us. It never did." The sun sank behind the ridgeline, bringing swift darkness. We set up camp on a flat rise overlooking the clearing, lighting a fire that crackled softly against the suffocating stillness of the forest. Nathan silently scattered tobacco to the 4 directions around our camp. Greg watched skeptically, his mouth forming questions he never asked. Jesse paced restlessly near the fire, glancing constantly toward the shadows. After the others bedded down, I sat awake, staring into the dark trees. Somewhere out there was Eli. I couldn't shake the feeling that something watched us. I glanced at Nathan. He hadn't moved from his spot by the fire. I moved closer, whispering, "What did your grandfather say lived out here?" Nathan didn't look at me, just gazed unblinking into the flames. "He called it the eater of men. Old, hungry, something from the times when these mountains belonged to no tribe. He said it sleeps until someone wakes it." I shivered despite the fire's heat. Before I could reply, Jesse jerked awake nearby, his eyes wide in panic. He scrambled backward, pointing frantically toward the trees behind me. "I saw someone," Jesse gasped, voice shaking. "Someone tall, walking out there behind the trees." We grabbed flashlights and weapons, immediately scanning the darkness beyond the camp's glow. Nothing, no tracks, no movement, only endless shadows cast by trees and snow. "You imagined it," Greg grumbled, clearly irritated but uncertain. But Jesse shook his head firmly, retreating closer to the fire. "I know what I saw." Nathan watched silently, jaw tense. Then he turned slowly back toward the fire. "Sleep if you can. Tomorrow will be harder." I tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Each rustle of the branches made my heart leap. Every shadow became something standing there, watching. I lay awake, eyes open, waiting for morning, knowing in my gut that whatever was out here was waiting too. Morning broke gray and bitter, a low-hanging mist shrouding Snowshoe Gulch like a damp cloak. Sleep had eluded me, coming only in restless bursts. I woke exhausted, with Nathan already packing gear methodically. Greg stood nearby, pacing impatiently, glancing between his watch and the silent trees. Jesse sat close to the dying embers of our fire, staring blankly into the snow. I pulled my coat tighter, ignoring the knot of dread in my stomach. We ate quickly, mostly in silence, our conversation limited to planning. Nathan stood, shouldered his pack, and spoke quietly. We follow the tracks as far as they lead. Then we reconsider. Everyone stays within eyesight. We retraced our steps back to the frozen creek. The footprints remained exactly as we'd left them, vanishing inexplicably at the icy edge. Nathan knelt again, brushing away fresh snow with a gloved hand. "This wasn't natural," he muttered softly, barely loud enough for me to hear. Greg cleared his throat impatiently, eager to dismiss Nathan's superstitions. "Then let's find what did it and be done. We're wasting daylight." Nathan said nothing, rising slowly, eyes scanning the ridge ahead. With no clear trail, we climbed the steep incline ahead, picking our way through tangled brush and dense pines. Snow crunched beneath our boots, echoing oddly through the silent woods. The farther we ascended, the more oppressive the quiet became, pressing down around us. Halfway up, Jesse stopped abruptly, voice trembling. "What the hell is that?" We turned, following his gaze upward. About 20 feet above, wedged firmly into the trunk of a towering pine, was the partially eaten skull of a deer. Its jaw hung crookedly, empty eye sockets staring down at us, grotesque and hollow. I felt bile rise in my throat. "Oh, who could do that?" Jesse whispered. Greg stepped forward, examining it closer, his face a mixture of disgust and confusion. "No blood, no drag marks. This doesn't make sense." Nathan was staring at the trees around us, eyes wide and alert. He motioned for silence, pointing to something farther ahead. We moved cautiously, eyes searching through the gloom. A dozen yards up, limbs of animals' antlers, deer legs, were wedged between branches, arranged deliberately high above the ground. Everything appeared drained, dried, almost mummified. I glanced at Nathan, whose face had turned pale. He shook his head slowly, voice tight. "This is a warning. It wants us gone." Greg snorted angrily, visibly shaken. "This is just some sick local playing games." Nathan met his eyes without blinking. "No man did this." Silence hung heavy between us. Finally, Nathan spoke, voice firm but quiet. "I will go no further. Whatever woke up in this place is older than us. We have intruded enough." I stared at him, anger and fear warring inside me. "My brother's still out here, Nathan. I'm not leaving until we find him." Nathan's eyes softened briefly, sympathy in his gaze. "I won't risk all of our lives, not for this." Greg set his jaw defiantly. "Then stay here. Caleb and I will finish this." I nodded, though my pulse pounded in my ears. Jesse looked back and forth uncertainly, then quietly took a step toward Nathan. "I'll stay too," he said, avoiding my gaze. I can't." Without another word, Greg and I pressed upward. The air seemed to grow colder, biting through my clothing. My fingers tightened on the handle of my flashlight, knuckles aching from the grip. After a few exhausting minutes, we reached the crest of the ridge. Greg stopped suddenly, eyes wide, face drained of color. "Caleb," he whispered hoarsely. Ahead of us, barely visible in the snowdrift, was a dark shape, a sleeve, a bright orange parka sleeve. My heart seized painfully as we scrambled forward, frantically digging. Eric Halstead's frozen face emerged, rigid and twisted into a final grimace of terror. His body was curled in a tight fetal position, both feet bare, blackened with frostbite. His eyes stared sightlessly at the sky. "God," Greg breathed, stepping back, horror evident on his face. "What happened to him?" I stood numb, unable to tear my gaze from the expression of pure dread locked onto Eric's face. A sudden snapping sound echoed through the trees behind us, making us both spin around. Greg raised his rifle, flashlight beam slicing through the thickening gloom. The woods were empty, yet I could feel something there, heavy and unseen, breathing slowly, patiently. The hairs rose on my neck as silence reclaimed the forest. "Let's get him back," I finally whispered. We carried Eric down awkwardly, our breath misting the air in hurried bursts, every step feeling heavier than the last. Nathan and Jesse met us halfway, their expressions grim. Nathan's eyes never left Eric's body. "Leave him here," Nathan said, voice flat. Greg bristled, furious. "Like hell we will." Nathan didn't flinch, didn't move. "Don't bring the marked one to the fire. It knows." Greg cursed bitterly, but I waved him silent. "We'll bury him nearby then," I said quietly, ignoring the nausea rising in my throat. We dug hurriedly, placing Eric carefully in the shallow grave, covering him swiftly with frozen earth and snow. All the while, Nathan stood watching the darkening woods, lips moving softly in prayer. That night around our fire, we barely spoke. Greg stared angrily into the darkness, gripping his rifle tightly. Jesse curled up near the fire, eyes wide with terror, flinching at every sound. Nathan remained silent, gaze fixed on the tree line. As exhaustion finally pulled at me, I heard it, a slow, heavy crunching through the snow, circling our camp just beyond the reach of the firelight. Each footfall was deliberate, patient, and close. When I lifted my head to look, nothing moved, yet the sound continued, circling endlessly, never quite seen. I shut my eyes, unable to block it out. As sleep claimed me, one thought echoed relentlessly in my mind. We were never alone out here. I woke to an ashen dawn, frost biting sharply at my exposed skin. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the campsite gray and lifeless. I sat up stiffly, body sore and mind still haunted by the heavy footsteps I had heard circling our camp through the night. Across from me, Nathan was already awake, silently sharpening a knife, eyes distant and troubled. I stood, stretching out the ache in my limbs, scanning the surroundings. Jesse was pacing nervously, head bowed, hands trembling. Greg loaded his rifle carefully, his jaw set tight with grim determination. Nathan finally spoke, eyes meeting mine briefly before turning back to his blade. "We need to leave. There's nothing left here we can save." "My brother's still out there, Nathan," I said, voice rough from the cold. "I won't leave him." Nathan sighed heavily, setting his knife down. He stood slowly, meeting my eyes. "Caleb, your brother isn't here anymore. Not the way you remember him. This place doesn't return what it takes." Greg interrupted sharply, stepping forward. "Enough with this superstition. We saw Eric's body. There's still hope Eli is alive out here." Nathan's eyes darkened. "What's alive out here isn't Eli anymore." I hesitated, uncertainty tightening my throat. Then Greg touched my shoulder, voice firm and reassuring. "We came here to find him. Let's finish it." I nodded slowly, pushing away Nathan's warning, and adjusted my pack. Jesse shook his head quickly, backing toward Nathan. I'm staying here. I can't go back up there." Nathan placed a reassuring hand on Jesse's shoulder, watching Greg and me prepare to leave. As we moved into the trees, Nathan called softly, his voice carrying clearly in the silence. "If you see it, don't run. Don't look it in the eyes." The climb back to the ridge was grueling. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of our breathing. Greg led, rifle clenched tightly in gloved hands. My thoughts spiraled, fear gnawing at the edges of my resolve. As we crested the ridge, we froze. The trees here had changed overnight. Branches snapped cleanly, arranged in a crude circle, limbs twisted like grotesque sculptures. In the snow, clearly visible, were Eli's boot prints leading deeper into the woods. My pulse quickened, hope and dread tangled painfully together. Greg stepped forward, cautiously examining the tracks. "These are fresh," he said softly, motioning me onward. We followed slowly, scanning every shadow, each breath tense and shallow. The prints wound deeper into the forest, disappearing behind a dense wall of tangled pines. Then from just beyond those trees came Eli's voice, thin, hollow, unmistakable. "Caleb? Is that you?" I broke forward without thinking, desperation propelling me past Greg. He called out sharply behind me, but I didn't slow. I pushed through the dense branches, emerging into a small clearing. Eli stood at the far end, barefoot in the snow, eyes glazed, lips cracked. His parka hung torn from his shoulders, skin pale and blue beneath. He trembled violently, staring blankly through me. "Eli," I said, breath hitching, "we're here. We found you." He didn't move, didn't acknowledge my words. Instead, his eyes widened, focused beyond me, terror flooding his features. A guttural roar erupted from the trees behind us, echoing painfully through the clearing. Greg spun around, rifle raised, shouting. I grabbed Eli's arm, pulling him toward me, panic surging in my chest. "Run," Greg shouted, firing blindly into the trees. His shots echoed uselessly, swallowed by the forest. I pulled Eli forward, stumbling through snow, heart hammering wildly. Behind me, I heard Greg scream, a raw, agonized sound abruptly silenced. I didn't turn back. We burst through the trees, slipping and falling toward Nathan and Jesse's waiting forms below. Nathan rushed to meet us, eyes wide with urgency. "Keep moving," he shouted, gripping Eli's other arm, pulling us down toward the camp. Behind us, branches snapped violently, something massive pursuing, unseen, its pace steady, relentless. My lungs burned as we scrambled to the snowmobiles. Jesse started the engines frantically, terror etched on his face. Nathan shoved Eli onto the sled behind Jesse, turning sharply toward the trees, chanting urgently under his breath. Then he pushed me toward the sled, eyes fierce and clear. "Go," he commanded. The engines roared to life, drowning out the deafening silence of the forest. I hesitated only a second before climbing on, glancing back just long enough to see Nathan facing the trees defiantly, lips moving, knife drawn. Then we were speeding away, the gulch disappearing behind us in a blur of white and shadow. We rode hard, not slowing until we reached open ground near the main trails. Only then did Jesse finally kill the engine. I slid off, legs shaking, and turned to Eli. He sat motionless, eyes distant, murmuring softly to himself. Jesse stood back, breathing heavily, pale and shaken. In that quiet moment, Eli's whispers became clear. "It watches through the bones. It watches through the bones." 2 days later, Eli was found wandering barefoot down an old logging road miles from Snowshoe Gulch. He remembered nothing, offering only fractured whispers about the Tall One and the Eater of Men. Greg's body was never recovered. Weeks passed before I visited Eli in the psychiatric facility in Kalispell. He refused to go near windows at night, eyes always fixed fearfully on shadows. As I prepared to leave, he finally spoke clearly, his voice strained, hollow. "You can't see it unless it wants you to, but you feel it. It waits behind the cold." I left him there, haunted by his words and the knowledge that whatever we awakened out in Snowshoe Gulch still lingered, patient and hungry, waiting silently behind the trees. I'd spent most of my adult life in places like this, quiet, remote, and rugged. It's a life I chose, a solace I found in the vast, untamed corners of the country. Before joining the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, I was a Yellowstone field researcher, comfortable with the profound silence of trekking alone through vast stretches of forest and backcountry. I'd faced down grizzlies and spent weeks with only wolves for company. But my assignment now, simple enough on paper, felt different from the start. Collar elk and collect biological samples in the Gila wilderness following a shocking and unexplained 40% population drop. The Gila is no Yellowstone, though. Yellowstone has a certain rugged grandeur, an openness to its wildness. The Gila is rougher somehow, more primal and less forgiving. Dense, thorny forests tumble into shadowed canyons that seem to swallow light whole. The terrain conspires to make you feel like an intruder. It feels untouched, not in a pristine way, but in a way that suggests even the locals know better than to venture too far in. I'd made camp 3 miles off the main trail last night near Turkey Feather Pass, and had pushed even farther north this morning toward the headwaters of Bear Wallow Creek. My objective was to collar elk in an area where motion-triggered cameras had picked up something deeply odd. Herds breaking apart in blind panic, scattering for no discernible reason. It didn't match the behavior of any known predator, wolf, lion, or bear. By noon, I reached the area I'd marked on my map, an open meadow, a serene-looking clearing ringed by a silent congregation of old-growth spruce and ponderosa pine. My boots sank slightly into the soft, dark earth, still damp from recent rains. I paused to get my bearings and check my gear. Tranquilizer rifle strapped securely over one shoulder, tagging supplies in my backpack, biological sampling kit secured to my belt. Everything was accounted for. The first sign that something was profoundly wrong hit me about 50 yards into the clearing. It was the quiet and unnatural, suffocating quiet. I've spent enough time outdoors to know that silence often signals danger, the tense pause before a predator strikes. But this was different. It wasn't a pause, it was a vacuum, as if sound itself was being actively suppressed. I scanned the tree line slowly, my hand resting on the stock of my rifle. Nothing, no shapes moving through the brush, no flicker of a tail, no signs of disturbance. I nearly stumbled on the first elk without seeing it. The animal lay perfectly still, collapsed in the tall grass as if it had simply lain down for a nap. Kneeling, I touched its flank gingerly. Cold, stone cold. Rigor mortis had already set in, the limbs stiff as iron, suggesting it had been dead for days. But that was impossible. The grass beneath the massive body was fresh, green, and completely undisturbed. There were no signs of a struggle, no churned-up mud, more unnerving still. No wounds, no blood, no bite marks from predators, not even a scratch. Nothing. As I rose and looked around the meadow, a cold knot tightened in my chest. There were more. 5 additional elk lay scattered evenly across the clearing, forming a near-perfect circle with the first one. Each was positioned in the same bizarre placid state, lying down, legs stiffly extended, necks stretched out, eyes wide open, staring at the empty sky. Their tongues protruded slightly, a grotesque uniform touch to an already surreal scene. I forced my training to take over, pushing back the rising tide of dread. I moved from one carcass to the next in a grim circuit around the clearing, documenting the same inexplicable symptoms. No trauma, no scavenging, no apparent cause of death. Methodically, my hands moving with a precision that belied the tremor in my gut, I took tissue samples, hair samples, blood samples from each animal. I labeled each glass tube with meticulous care, the scratch of my pen the only sound in the unnerving stillness. The whole time, I fought off the distinct and terrifying feeling that the forest had gone even quieter, as if it were holding its breath, watching me. It took me an hour to finish. The samples were critical and needed to get to the lab immediately. But when I tried my satellite phone, the signal struggled, flickering with a single weak bar before dropping out completely. No connection. I tucked the precious samples securely into a cooled pouch in my pack and stood, knowing I would have to carry them out myself tomorrow morning. As dusk began to bleed through the trees, I made camp just outside the meadow, seeking the meager shelter of a thick spruce stand. I wasn't hungry, I wasn't tired, I was coiled tight, every instinct screaming at me to pack up and get out now. But logic, the scientist in me, held me back. There had to be a rational explanation. A localized disease, a toxic fungus, an environmental poison. I couldn't abandon my assignment without more data. I lay awake long after darkness fell, staring at the thin nylon of my tent wall, listening. The forest had finally begun to stir again. The faint rustlings of nocturnal animals, the distant soothing murmur of the creek. Normalcy was returning. Then everything went quiet once more. In that absolute silence came a sound I know I will never be able to erase from my memory. A long, piercing scream that erupted from somewhere high above the ridge. It wasn't human. It wasn't elk, mountain lion, bear, or coyote. I've heard every sound the North American wilderness can produce, and this was none of them. The scream rose in a sharp, agonizing crescendo, a sound of pure terror and malice, and then it abruptly cut off, leaving a void of silence that felt deeper and more threatening than before. My heart hammered against my ribs as I sat bolt upright, my hand closing around the cold steel of my tranquilizer rifle. Then came a sudden sharp snap of brush. Close, maybe 20 yards out. Another followed, slightly off to my right. Whatever was out there was moving deliberately, circling my tent at irregular intervals. Each crack of a branch, each crunch of leaf litter sounded heavy, intentional. This was no deer wandering by. With a trembling hand, I clicked on my high-lumen flashlight, tore open the tent flap, and blasted the beam into the trees. I saw nothing, just the stark white trunks of aspens, the deep shadows between them, and empty spaces where something should have been standing. Slowly, methodically, I swept the light in a full circle around my campsite. Nothing moved, but I knew with a certainty that went deeper than sight that something was there, watching me from just beyond the edge of the light. I zipped the tent closed again and waited, my back pressed against my pack, rifle in my lap, eyes wide open in the oppressive dark, fully aware I wouldn't sleep another minute until daylight came. At the first pale hint of dawn, I abandoned any pretense of scientific duty. My fingers, clumsy and shaking, fumbled with my gear. It wasn't the morning cold that caused the tremor, but a raw-edged dread I'd never experienced before. Not even when I'd been bluff-charged by a grizzly in Yellowstone. Every instinct I possessed shouted at me to leave, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the clearing of dead elk, between me and whatever had patiently circled my tent during the long, dark night. I set out quickly, heading south along a narrow game trail that would eventually lead toward the ranger station near Bonner Canyon. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the trees, I forced myself to breathe evenly, to rationalize my fear, exhaustion, solitude, and an overactive imagination playing cruel tricks. But no amount of logic could erase the memory of that scream echoing through the darkness. By midday, I came across a cluster of elk bones scattered across the trail. I knelt to examine them, and a fresh wave of ice flowed through my veins. The bones were entirely clean, unnaturally stripped of every shred of muscle, sinew, and ligament. What remained had been carefully arranged in precise anatomical order. The ribs laid out in a perfect parallel fan, the vertebrae aligned in a neat, delicate column. There were no teeth marks from scavengers, no evidence of insects. The scene felt clinical, sterile, almost purposeful. It wasn't a kill site. It was an exhibit. I stood back up, the acidic taste of bile rising in my throat. A sudden sound behind me, a heavy footstep, the definitive crunch of a boot on gravel so close it sent a jolt of electricity up my spine. I spun around, pulse leaping, scanning the trees and the trail behind me. Nothing, only silence. I exhaled sharply, my breath clouding in the air. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, but the forest around me felt suffocating, oppressive. I started walking again, faster this time. After only a few steps, the sound returned, a distinct rhythmic crunch on the forest floor, matching my stride perfectly. I took one step. A second later, a step echoed mine. I took 3 quick steps. 3 quick crunches answered. I stopped dead. So did it. I tested it again and again, raw panic clawing at my throat as the horrifying pattern continued. This wasn't an echo or a coincidence. It was deliberate, mocking mimicry. Unable to stand it any longer, I broke from the trail. Veering sharply into the dense undergrowth, I plunged through thorny catclaw acacia, the spines ripping at my pants and legs, drawing blood. I didn't care. I welcomed the pain. Something tangible to anchor me against the rising wave of unreasoning fear. The footsteps behind me ceased for a moment, only to be replaced by the heavy snapping and crunching of something much larger, forcing its way through the brush nearby, paralleling my course. Desperation surged through me. I pressed forward, ignoring the pain, until the forest floor gave way to a steep, rocky slope, I scrambled up, loose scree slipping and clattering beneath my boots. Halfway up the incline, I paused to catch my breath, my lungs burning, gripping the rough stone for support. And that's when I saw it. Below me, standing motionless under a deep rock overhang, was a figure unlike anything I had ever encountered in life or nightmare. It was tall, impossibly so, at least 7 feet, with unnaturally elongated limbs draped in what looked like ragged patchwork animal hides. Its body was emaciated, skeletal, the outline of its ribcage clearly visible beneath the tattered skins. But the head, I couldn't clearly make out its features. There was only a hollow, absolute darkness beneath what appeared to be some sort of ceremonial hood fashioned from antlers and bone. I was frozen, my breath trapped in my chest. It didn't move or speak. It just remained perfectly still, a silent, tenebrous shape observing me from the shadows of the overhang. My paralysis broke in a surge of pure adrenaline. I turned and lunged upward, scrambling desperately over the jagged terrain. My pack caught on a jutting piece of granite, and without a second thought, I shrugged out of the straps, letting it fall away, my precious supplies scattering down the rocks. I couldn't afford to stop, couldn't dare to look back. My lungs felt like they were on fire. My legs screamed in agony, but the terror drove me relentlessly forward. Behind me, the sound began again. The clear, rhythmic footsteps, steady and unhurried, crunching on leaves and breaking twigs. Whatever it was, it moved effortlessly through the same obstacles I struggled to navigate. I saw a narrow crevice between 2 massive boulders and stumbled into it, pressing myself flat into the gap, my chest heaving, sweat streaming down my face. The approaching footsteps slowed, and finally stopped just beyond my hiding spot. I held my breath, willing myself silent, listening. And then I heard it, the low, rasping sound of slow, measured breathing just on the other side of the rock. It was so close I imagined I could smell its breath, a rancid, earthy odor, sour and ancient. My heartbeat pounded in my ears like a drum, a frantic countdown to inevitable discovery. But discovery never came. Instead, I remained wedged there, tense and rigid, as daylight gradually faded into the deep purple of twilight. The breathing never shifted, never retreated. It simply lingered, a patient, terrifying presence in the dark. All I could do was wait, eyes wide, muscles aching, knowing I had no choice but to endure the night. The first pale streak of dawn cut through the sky, and I forced my stiff, aching body from the narrow gap. Dried blood crusted the deep scratches on my legs. I stepped gingerly into the open, bracing myself for the figure that had tracked me relentlessly. But the space beyond the boulders was empty, silent. Nothing moved. I started cautiously downhill, trying to orient myself toward the Bonner Ranger cabin. My abandoned pack, along with my map, sat phone, and supplies, lay scattered somewhere on the slope behind me. But I knew this part of the wilderness well enough to navigate by instinct. I moved slowly at first, fighting dizziness and exhaustion, every snapping twig making me jump, my head constantly swiveling to glance over my shoulder. The figure was gone, yet the sensation of being watched never subsided. Hours passed. With each mile, my pace quickened as the harsh, rocky landscape gave way to more forgiving terrain. Gradually, landmarks became familiar, the long-abandoned logging road, the crooked stump where the trail forked. Finally, just before noon, I stumbled upon something that made me freeze mid-step. There, lying open and perfectly centered on the trail, was my field notebook. My chest tightened. I knew for a fact I'd packed it securely in a side pocket of my pack, yet here it sat, miles from where I'd dropped it, untouched except for one small detail. The elastic band that held it closed was missing. Kneeling cautiously, I examined it, half expecting some sinister message scrawled across its pages. But they were pristine, undisturbed. A cold dread worse than anything before ran down my spine. This wasn't just a monster, it was intelligent. It was toying with me. Carefully, I placed the notebook in my pocket and continued on, forcing myself not to dwell on the impossible logistics of how it had gotten there. The air felt oddly cold for midday. Though the weather had been mild, my breath began to condense visibly before me. I pulled out the portable thermometer clipped to my jacket. It read 64 Fahrenheit, yet I shivered uncontrollably from a chill that felt like it was radiating from the inside out. By the time I finally reached the ranger station, dusk was creeping over the wilderness again. The small wooden cabin stood alone, silent and empty. The door was unlocked as it always was, a common refuge for emergencies. I stumbled inside and without hesitation barricaded the door with a heavy wooden table, shoving it tight against the frame until it wouldn't budge. Only then did my legs finally give out. I sank to the cabin's rough wooden floor, my body shaking with a violence I couldn't control. Exhausted, dehydrated, and physically drained, sleep took me swiftly. Darkness claimed my consciousness, a black, dreamless void, free of movement, free of fear. It felt mercifully empty. I awoke early the next morning, still curled on the floor, blessedly untouched. Outside, the world had returned to normal. Birds were singing. Sunlight filtered gently through the cabin's dusty windows. Gathering what remained of my strength, I unbarricaded the door, stepped outside, and began the final long trek out along the service road. Within hours, a forest patrol truck spotted me limping down the dirt road. They rushed me to the district office, where I handed over the carefully preserved samples. The next 2 weeks were a blur of debriefings and medical checks, of trying to regain normalcy, to erase the memories of that shadowed canyon, the figure beneath the rock overhang, the circle of elk frozen stiff, their wide-open eyes staring endlessly at nothing. When the lab results finally arrived, my supervisor, a grizzled man named Frank, called me into his office. His expression was grim as he placed the report on his desk between us. "Rachel," he began, his voice low, "the elk you found, something happened to their bodies on a cellular level. The tissues showed evidence of flash freezing, the kind of rapid crystallization of intracellular water that normally only happens in cryogenics or sudden exposure to sub-zero conditions. But it was mild out there, right?" I nodded slowly, my throat dry. Yes. Temperatures were in the 60s. He hesitated, drumming his fingers on the desk. And there was something else. Their adrenal glands were flooded with stress hormones. The levels were, well, they were physically impossible. Higher than any biological organism should be able to produce. They were literally scared to death, and then frozen solid in an instant. His eyes, full of a deep, weary concern, fixed on mine. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice until it was almost a whisper. "Listen, Rachel, this isn't the first time something inexplicable has come out of the Gila. There are old reports, stories from ranchers we always dismissed as folklore. If I were you, I'd request reassignment, somewhere closer to civilization." He didn't have to tell me twice. The radio crackled to life at 2:47 p.m. on October 15, 2019, interrupting what had been a relatively peaceful Tuesday afternoon. I was Vincent Russo, 34 years old at the time, and had been working as a game warden for the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks for nearly 9 years. I was sitting in my patrol truck outside a local diner, finishing up paperwork from a morning citation when dispatch's voice cut through the static. "Unit 47, we have a report of illegal discharge of firearm. Suspect was shooting at deer from a blue pickup truck on Clearwater Ridge Road, approximately 3 miles south of the Riverside intersection. Homeowner witnessed the incident and reports the vehicle fled southbound." I keyed the mic, my coffee growing cold in the cup holder. "Unit 47 responding, ETA 15 minutes. The autumn air was crisp as I pulled onto Clearwater Ridge Road, the aspens showing their golden colors against the backdrop of dark evergreens. It was the kind of afternoon that usually made me grateful for my job, until it didn't. The road wound through dense forest, broken occasionally by large properties carved out of the wilderness. These were the homes of people who'd moved here for privacy, for the solitude that only Montana could offer. As I approached the reported location, I spotted the house immediately. It was a sprawling log structure set back from the road, with a massive lawn that gradually transitioned into thick woodland. The property screamed money, probably some tech executive or retired surgeon who'd bought their slice of paradise. I pulled over and radioed for backup, standard procedure for any investigation involving firearms. 10 minutes later, Ranger Bobby Kowalski arrived in his own patrol vehicle. Bobby was a veteran with 23 years on the force, a man who'd seen enough poaching incidents to fill a book. His weathered face and steady demeanor made him the perfect partner for situations like this. We'd worked together dozens of times, and I trusted his judgment completely. "What have we got, Vince?" Bobby asked as he stepped out of his truck, adjusting his gear belt. Shots fired from a blue pickup. Target was deer on private property. Homeowner called it in. I gestured toward the house. Figure we should canvass the area first, see if we can find any evidence before we knock on doors. The shoulder of the road was soft dirt and gravel, perfect for holding evidence. We walked slowly along the edge, our eyes scanning for shell casings, tire tracks, anything that might tell us what happened here. The October sun filtered through the canopy above, creating dancing shadows that made our search both easier and harder. Bobby found it first. "Here," he called, crouching down near a patch of disturbed earth. Fresh .30-06 casing, still warm. I walked over and examined the brass shell. It gleamed in the afternoon light, and when I touched it with the back of my hand, I could feel the residual heat from being fired. The placement told us everything. The shooter had indeed been positioned on the road shoulder, firing toward the property. Textbook poaching behavior. "I'll document this," I said, pulling out my phone to photograph the evidence. "You want to talk to the homeowner?" Bobby nodded and headed toward the house while I bagged the shell casing and began looking for additional evidence. The trajectory of the shot would have carried the bullet toward the large lawn and into the tree line beyond. If the deer had been hit, there might be blood, fur, or other signs of impact. I worked my way methodically across the lawn, my eyes scanning the grass for any disturbance. The property was immaculate, clearly maintained by professional landscapers. But as I approached the edge where manicured grass gave way to wild forest, something caught my attention. A dark stain on the bark of a large oak tree, about chest high. Moving closer, I could see the fresh scar in the wood where a high-powered rifle bullet had struck. The impact was clean and deep, the kind of mark that spoke to significant velocity and stopping power. I photographed the damage from multiple angles, making note of the height and angle for our report. But it was what I found at the base of the tree that made my stomach tighten. Dark droplets spattered the fallen leaves, blood still wet enough to glisten in the dappled sunlight. The deer had been hit after all. Following a blood trail is something every game warden learns early in their career. Wounded animals leave signatures in their wake, droplets of blood, disturbed vegetation, tracks that show injury or distress. This trail was different somehow, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly why at first. The blood drops were larger than I'd expected from a deer, even a large buck. They seemed to hit the ground with more force, creating splatter patterns that suggested significant volume. But what really caught my attention was the spacing between drops. The stride length was enormous, far longer than any deer I'd tracked. I documented each major blood drop with my phone, following the trail as it led deeper into the forest. The terrain began to rise, a gentle slope at first that quickly steepened into a proper ridge. The trees grew thicker here, creating a canopy so dense that the afternoon light barely penetrated. Pine needles and fallen leaves muffled my footsteps as I climbed. The blood trail continued up the ridge, but the drops were becoming more sparse. Either the animal was bleeding less, or it was moving faster despite its injury. Both possibilities were troubling in their own way. A wounded deer that stops bleeding might survive, but it also might be dying slowly somewhere in these woods. A wounded deer that speeds up despite blood loss was showing signs of panic or desperation. I reached the crest of the ridge and paused to catch my breath. The view beyond was striking. A narrow gully cut through the landscape like a scar, its bottom choked with thick brush and fallen timber. During spring runoff or heavy storms, this would be a rushing waterway. Now, in the dry autumn, it was a corridor of tangled vegetation stretching off into the distance. The blood trail had vanished completely. I spent several minutes combing the area around the ridgeline, looking for any sign of where the wounded animal might have gone. The ground here was rocky and covered with a thick mat of pine needles that wouldn't hold tracks well. After 20 minutes of fruitless searching, I decided to take a different approach. Standing still, I listened. The forest around me was alive with small sounds, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant call of a crow, the scurrying of small animals through the underbrush. But underneath it all, I could hear something else. Movement, deliberate movement through the brush down in the gully, coming from somewhere to my right. My first thought was relief. The deer was still mobile, which meant it might survive its wound if the bullet had passed through muscle rather than hitting vital organs. I'd be able to assess its condition and decide whether it needed to be put down humanely or could be left to heal naturally. I was about to call out to announce my presence, standard procedure when tracking potentially dangerous wounded animals, when the wind shifted. The smell that hit me nearly made me retch. It wasn't the smell of blood or even fresh death. This was something far worse. The overwhelming stench of advanced decomposition mixed with other odors I recognized from crime scenes I'd assisted with over the years. The smell of human waste, of infection, of things that should be buried deep underground. My hand instinctively moved to the radio on my belt, though I wasn't sure what I'd report. The movement in the gully was getting closer, and the stench was growing stronger. Whatever was making its way through the brush wasn't trying to be quiet. I could hear branches snapping, the scrape of something being dragged across rocks and fallen logs. The sounds were wrong somehow, not the careful steps of an injured deer picking its way through dense cover, but something far more careless and heavy. I remained motionless on the ridge, every instinct telling me to stay hidden while my curiosity warred with a growing sense of dread. Through the gaps in the trees, I began to catch glimpses of movement, dark shapes shifting between the trunks, too brief and fragmented to make sense of. The thing that emerged from the deeper woods was not a deer. At first, my brain simply refused to process what I was seeing. The shape was wrong, the size impossible, the very existence of such a creature contrary to everything I knew about the natural world. But as it moved closer, passing between the widely spaced trees in the gully, the details became unavoidable. It stood at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to span half the width of the narrow ravine. The entire form was covered in dark brown hair, but not the clean, healthy fur of a living animal. This hair was matted and patchy, hanging in clumps from frame that moved with an awkward, shambling gait. The face was the worst part. As it turned slightly in my direction, I got a clear view of features that belonged in a nightmare. The bone structure was massive and primitive, like something from a museum display of early human evolution. But where there should have been intelligent eyes, I saw only horror. The left eye socket was completely empty, just a dark hollow that seemed to stare at nothing. The right eye was intact but clouded completely white, the kind of milky opacity I'd seen in animals dead for days. The mouth hung open, revealing teeth stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify. Part of the lower lip appeared to be missing entirely, giving the face a lopsided, grotesque appearance. But it was the body that made me understand this thing was not alive, despite the fact that it was walking. The torso showed massive trauma, deep gashes that revealed gray muscle tissue beneath. The wounds were old, with edges that had dried and darkened rather than healed. These weren't fresh injuries from the rifle shot I'd been tracking. The abdomen was largely gone. What remained of the chest cavity yawned open, and I could see desiccated organs hanging loose inside. Intestines dangled from the right side of the torso like grotesque party streamers, swaying with each labored step. The smell that accompanied this vision was indescribable. Every breath I took made me fight the urge to vomit. The left leg bore a massive wound on the outer thigh, a chunk of flesh and muscle simply absent, leaving a crater that should have made walking impossible. But somehow this thing continued to move, dragging itself forward with determination that defied all logic. The right foot was completely gone. Where there should have been toes and a heel, there was only the blunt end of an ankle bone, worn smooth from contact with rocks and dirt. The creature was literally walking on its own skeletal remains, each step producing a wet, grinding sound that carried clearly through the still air. I had stopped breathing entirely, afraid that even the smallest sound might draw its attention. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps this was some kind of elaborate hoax, a movie prop that had been abandoned in the woods. But the smell was too real, too overwhelming to be anything artificial. And the way it moved, the casual indifference to injuries that should have been instantly fatal, spoke to something far beyond human understanding. The creature continued its shambling progress down the gully, following some path or purpose I couldn't comprehend. It moved with the aimless determination of something operating on instinct alone, like a wind-up toy that had been set in motion and couldn't stop. Each step was deliberate but uncoordinated, as if the connection between mind and body had been severed but the motor functions continued anyway. I watched in horrified fascination as it gradually disappeared into the deeper woods, the sound of its passage fading until only the smell remained. Even after I could no longer see it, the stench lingered in the air like a presence, a reminder that what I'd witnessed was undeniably real. For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I remained frozen on that ridge, my mind struggling to process what I'd witnessed. Every rational thought told me that what I'd seen was impossible. Dead things don't walk. They don't pursue mysterious purposes through mountain forests. They don't exist in a state between life and death that defies every law of nature I'd ever learned. But the evidence of my senses was overwhelming. The smell still hung in the air around me, a mixture of decay and corruption that no amount of imagination could conjure. My eyes had recorded details with crystal clarity: the empty eye socket, the missing flesh, the impossible locomotion of something that should have been motionless in a grave somewhere. As the immediate shock began to wear off, other sensations crept in. The October air suddenly felt colder against my skin. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper and more threatening. Every small sound in the forest around me, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made me jump with adrenaline-fueled terror. I needed to get back to Bobby. I needed to get back to civilization, to radio communication, to the world of logical explanations and rational responses. But I also needed to move carefully. The thing I'd seen had disappeared deeper into the woods, but I had no idea where it was headed or if it might circle back. Forcing myself to move slowly and quietly, I began retracing my path down the ridge. Every step felt exposed, vulnerable. The trees that had seemed like peaceful wilderness 20 minutes ago now felt like potential hiding places for horrors I couldn't imagine. My hand rested on the grip of my service weapon, though I had serious doubts about whether bullets would have any effect on something that was already dead. The descent seemed to take forever. I found myself pausing after every few steps, listening for any sign that I was being followed. The normal sounds of the forest had returned, birds calling, small animals moving through the underbrush, but they felt different now, as if the entire ecosystem was on edge. When I finally reached the bottom of the ridge and stepped back onto the manicured lawn of the property, the relief was overwhelming. The sight of Bobby's patrol vehicle parked on the road shoulder was like a beacon of normalcy in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. Bobby was standing by the oak tree where I'd found the bullet impact, examining the damaged bark with professional interest. He looked up as I approached, and I could see his expression change immediately. Years of law enforcement experience had taught him to read faces, and mine must have been telling a story he didn't like. "Find something?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. I opened my mouth to answer and found I had no idea what to say. How do you explain the impossible? How do you tell a respected colleague, a man who's seen everything the Montana wilderness has to offer, that you've just witnessed something that shouldn't exist? "Had a scare in the woods," I managed, using our standard phrase for encounters with the unexplained. Bobby studied my face for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. He'd been a game warden long enough to know that the wilderness held secrets, that sometimes officers encountered things that defied easy explanation. The unofficial policy was simple: if it didn't threaten public safety, You filed it away as one of those stories you told around campfires." "The homeowner didn't see much," Bobby said, steering the conversation back to familiar territory. "Heard the shot? Looked out the window in time to see a blue pickup driving away fast. Didn't get a plate number but said it looked like an older Ford, maybe early 2000s. I nodded, grateful for the return to normal police work. "Found the bullet impact in that oak. Looks like a clean miss on whatever they were shooting at." It was a lie, of course. The thing I'd seen in the woods bore wounds that could have come from a dozen different sources, but I was certain none of them were from today's hunting incident. Whatever had happened to create that creature, it had occurred long before some poacher decided to take an illegal shot at deer from the roadside. "You okay, Vince?" Bobby asked quietly. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The choice of words made me shudder involuntarily. A ghost would have been easy to explain compared to what I'd actually encountered. Ghosts were supposed to be translucent, ethereal, confined to old houses and ancient graveyards. They didn't shamble through mountain forests with intestines hanging from their rib cages. "I'm fine," I said, though we both knew it wasn't true. "Just need some water." I walked back to my patrol truck and pulled a bottle of water from the cooler I kept in the back seat. The first sip tasted like salvation, washing away the residual flavor of decay that seemed to cling to my mouth and throat. I drank the entire bottle without stopping, then opened another. Bobby finished documenting the bullet impact and collecting additional evidence while I tried to regain my composure. We spent another 30 minutes canvassing the area, looking for tire tracks or other signs that might help identify the shooter. It was routine work, the kind of investigation I'd conducted hundreds of times before, but my heart wasn't in it. Every time I looked toward the tree line, I found myself searching for signs of movement. Every shift in the wind made me tense, waiting for that horrible smell to return. The knowledge that something impossible was out there, wandering through the same forests I patrolled daily, had fundamentally changed my relationship with the wilderness I'd devoted my career to protecting. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. I sat in my small apartment on the outskirts of Helena, nursing a beer and staring at my laptop screen, trying to find some rational explanation for the creature I'd encountered. My initial searches yielded the usual collection of Bigfoot sightings, blurry photographs, and conspiracy theories, but none of them described anything like what I'd witnessed. The Sasquatch enthusiasts talked about intelligent, elusive creatures that avoided human contact. They described animals that were very much alive, possibly even possessing a primitive culture and communication system. What I'd seen bore no resemblance to those accounts. The thing in the woods had been unmistakably dead, moving through some process that violated every principle of biology I understood. I expanded my search to include zombies, though I felt ridiculous typing the words into the search bar. Most of the results were entertainment-related: movies, television shows, video games. The few scientific articles I found discussed Haitian folklore and the use of neurotoxins to create zombie-like states in humans, but again, nothing that explained how a massive ape-like creature could continue functioning with catastrophic injuries and obvious decomposition. Around midnight, I stumbled across something that made me sit up straighter. It was a brief mention in a research paper about chronic wasting disease, CWD, a neurological disorder that affects deer, elk, and other cervids. The disease causes animals to lose weight, display abnormal behavior, and eventually die. But what caught my attention was a single paragraph about unusual locomotion in affected animals. According to the researchers, deer with advanced CWD sometimes continued moving even after brain function had severely deteriorated. They described animals that seemed to be operating on basic motor impulses alone, walking in circles or straight lines for hours without apparent purpose. The disease affected the brain in ways that disrupted normal behavior while leaving basic movement patterns intact. Could something similar affect other species? Could there be a variant of CWD that affected primates, or whatever species the creature I'd seen represented? I spent the next hour researching prion diseases, the category of neurological disorders that included CWD. Mad cow disease was another example, along with Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans. The more I read, the more plausible it seemed. Predor diseases worked by corrupting proteins in the brain, causing them to misfold and clump together. The process was irreversible and always fatal, but it could take months or even years to fully destroy neural function. In the meantime, affected animals displayed increasingly bizarre behavior as different parts of their brains shut down. But even this explanation had major holes. The creature I'd seen wasn't just neurologically impaired, it was physically decomposed. The missing flesh, the exposed organs, the empty eye socket. These were signs of death and decay, not disease. No amount of prion corruption could explain how something in that condition could continue walking around. I closed the laptop and tried to sleep, but rest wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that horrible face again, the empty socket where an eye should have been, the mouth hanging open in a permanent expression of mindless hunger, the shambling gait that spoke of something operating beyond the normal constraints of life and death. The next morning, I called in sick for the first time in 3 years. I couldn't face the prospect of going back into those woods, of patrolling the same area where I knew that thing was wandering. My supervisor was understanding miner's ranger work was stressful, and mental health days were not uncommon in our profession. Instead, I drove to the University of Montana in Missoula, about 2 hours south of Helena. I'd heard they had an excellent wildlife biology department, and I hoped someone there might be able to offer insights into what I'd witnessed. I couldn't tell them the truth, of course, but I could ask hypothetical questions about prion diseases and their effects on large mammals. Dr. Sandra Whitmore was a professor of wildlife pathology who'd spent 20 years studying disease in wild animal populations. She was in her early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of patient demeanor that made her popular with both students and visiting law enforcement officers seeking expertise. Game wardens don't usually show up asking about CWD unless they found something troubling, she said after I'd introduced myself and explained my interest in neurological diseases. Hypothetically, I said carefully, what would be the most extreme symptoms you might see in an animal with advanced prion disease? Dr. Whitmore leaned back in her chair, considering the question. Well, the brain deterioration can be quite extensive. We've documented deer that walk in perfect circles for hours, elk that approach humans without fear, moose that forget how to eat. The disease essentially erases learned behaviors and eventually disrupts even basic motor functions. Could an animal continue moving even if it was severely injured? That's an interesting question. Pain reception would certainly be affected as the disease progresses. We've seen deer with broken legs that continue trying to walk normally, as if they can't process the injury signals their bodies are sending. I thought about the creature's missing foot, the way it had walked on its ankle bone without apparent distress. What about primates? Could they be affected by similar diseases? Dr. Whitmore's expression became more guarded. There are prion diseases that affect primates, certainly. Kuru was documented in human populations in Papua New Guinea, but I'm not aware of any cases involving North American ape species. Because there aren't any North American ape species, I said. Exactly. She studied my face carefully. Is there something specific you're dealing with, Ranger? I wanted desperately to tell her everything, to describe what I'd seen and get her professional opinion. But I could already imagine how that conversation would go. At best, she'd think I was suffering from stress-related hallucinations. At worst, she'd question my fitness for duty and recommend psychiatric evaluation. Just trying to understand the possibilities, I said. Thank you for your time. As I drove back toward Helena, Dr. Whitmore's words echoed in my mind. There weren't any North American ape species, which meant that either I'd witnessed something that science hadn't yet cataloged, or I'd seen something that had once been cataloged but was supposed to be extinct. The third possibility, that I'd simply imagined the entire encounter, was becoming harder to accept. The memory was too vivid, too detailed, too consistent with itself to be a hallucination, and Bobby had seen the change in my demeanor, had recognized that I'd encountered something that shook me to my core. No, what I'd seen was real. The question was what to do about it. 3 days later, I forced myself to go back. I couldn't continue avoiding the area indefinitely without arousing suspicion from my supervisor. More importantly, I needed to know if the creature was still out there, still wandering through forests where hikers and hunters might encounter it. Whatever that thing was, it represented a potential danger to the public, and I had a professional duty to assess that threat. I returned to the same location where Bobby and I had investigated the poaching incident. But this time I came alone. I parked my patrol truck in the same spot on the shoulder and sat for several minutes, gathering my courage. The October weather had turned colder, with low-hanging clouds that threatened snow. The forest looked different in the gray light, more ominous and less welcoming. I'd brought additional equipment this time, a digital camera with a telephoto lens, a portable GPS unit, and extra batteries for my radio. If I encountered the creature again, I wanted to document it properly. The photos would either provide evidence of something extraordinary or reveal that my memory had been corrupted by fear and stress. The walk up the ridge felt longer this time, each step weighted with dread. The blood trail I'd followed 3 days earlier had been washed away by a brief rainstorm, leaving no trace of the original poaching incident. But I wasn't looking for deer blood anymore. I was looking for signs of something far more disturbing. I reached the crest of the ridge and paused, listening carefully. The forest was quieter than it had been during my previous visit. Even the birds seemed subdued, their calls muted and infrequent. The silence felt oppressive, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. Moving carefully down into the gully where I'd first seen the creature, I began searching for physical evidence. If something that large and that badly decomposed had passed through this area, it should have left traces, footprints, disturbed vegetation, perhaps even tissue samples caught on branches or thorns. I found them near a fallen log about 50 yards from where the creature had first appeared. The tracks were unlike anything I'd seen in 20 years of wildlife work. They were enormous, easily twice the size of the largest human footprint, but irregularly shaped. The right track showed clear evidence of the missing foot I'd observed, just a blunt impression where toes should have been. But it was the depth of the impressions that truly unsettled me. Despite the creature's obvious state of decay, it was still incredibly heavy. The tracks sank deep into the soft earth, deeper than even a healthy animal of that size should have made. It was as if the thing was made of stone rather than flesh and bone. I photographed each clear track from multiple angles, using a dollar bill for scale reference. The GPS coordinates went into my notebook along with detailed descriptions of what I'd found. This was evidence that could be analyzed, measured, compared to known animal tracks. It was proof that I hadn't imagined the encounter. Following the trail of tracks led me deeper into the gully, through areas where the canopy was so thick that afternoon felt like twilight. The creature had moved in a fairly straight line, pushing through thick brush without deviation. Whatever intelligence had once guided this thing, it no longer bothered with efficient pathfinding. After about a quarter mile, the tracks led to something that made my blood freeze. There, in a small clearing surrounded by ancient pines, I found what could only be described as a nest. It wasn't built in the way that living animals construct shelters. There was no apparent design or engineering involved. Instead, it looked like someone had simply gathered every piece of organic debris in the area and piled it into a rough circle. Dead branches, fallen logs, clumps of moss, even what appeared to be animal bones, all heaped together in a depression between the roots of a massive tree. The smell hit me as I approached. It was the same overwhelming stench of decay I'd encountered during my first sighting, but concentrated and intensified. This was clearly where the creature had been spending time, perhaps sleeping, or simply waiting for whatever drove it to move. I forced myself to examine the nest more closely, breathing through my mouth to minimize the assault on my senses. Mixed in with the organic debris were items that didn't belong, pieces of fabric, a few scattered coins, what looked like a hiking boot. These were clearly things the creature had encountered and collected, though whether by accident or design was impossible to determine. Most disturbing were the bones. There were far too many of them, and they came from a variety of different animals. Deer bones mixed with what might have been elk, along with smaller fragments that could have come from rabbits or birds. Some of the bones showed clear tooth marks, suggesting they'd been gnawed on. But the marks were wrong, too large and too widely spaced to have come from any known predator in the area. I was photographing a particularly large femur when I heard the sound. It came from somewhere behind me, back toward the direction I'd approached from. The same casual crashing through underbrush that I'd heard during my first encounter, accompanied by that awful smell getting stronger. The creature was returning to its nest, and I was directly in its path. My training kicked in immediately. I had two choices: try to hide and hope it passed by, or retreat quickly before it arrived. Given the size of the clearing and the lack of adequate cover, hiding wasn't really an option. I gathered my equipment as quietly as possible and began moving toward the far side of the clearing, away from the approaching sounds. But I wasn't fast enough. As I reached the edge of the trees, the creature emerged into the clearing behind me. This time, I got a much clearer look at it. In the gray afternoon light, every horrifying detail was visible with crystal clarity. The missing eye socket was even more pronounced than I'd remembered, a dark hollow that seemed to peer into nothing. The clouded remaining eye showed no recognition or intelligence, just the blank stare of something operating on pure instinct. The creature's movements were more labored than they'd been 3 days earlier. The missing foot made each step a struggle, and I could see that new injuries had appeared on its torso. Several ribs were now visible through torn flesh, and something that might have been part of a lung protruded from a gap between bones. But despite its deteriorating condition, the thing was still mobile, still driven by whatever force animated it. It shambled directly toward the nest, apparently unaware of my presence just 20 yards away. I remained perfectly still, barely breathing, as it began examining the contents of its grotesque shelter. What I witnessed next will haunt me for the rest of my life. The creature picked up one of the bones from the pile, a deer femur that still had scraps of flesh attached, and began gnawing on it with mechanical persistence. There was no hunger in the action, no satisfaction or enjoyment. It was simply a motion the thing performed, like a machine following its programming. The sound of teeth scraping against bone echoed through the clearing. Dark fluid, whether blood or some other bodily fluid, dripped from the creature's mouth as it chewed on tissues that were already in advanced stages of decomposition. The sight was so revolting that I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to prevent myself from retching. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the creature dropped the bone and settled into the nest. It didn't lie down in the way a living animal would rest. Instead, it simply stopped moving, remaining upright but motionless, like a horrible statue placed in a shrine of decay. I waited another 10 minutes before beginning my retreat. Moving with extreme caution, I worked my way out of the gully and back up the ridge, constantly checking over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't being followed. Only when I reached my patrol truck did I allow myself to breathe normally again. Sitting in my truck with the engine running and the heater blasting, I stared at the photos I'd taken on my camera's small display screen. The images were clear and detailed, showing tracks and evidence that no rational person could dismiss as imagination or hallucination. I had proof now, documented, measurable proof that something impossible was living in the Montana wilderness. But proof of what, exactly? And more importantly, what was I supposed to do with this information? The professional thing to do would be to report my findings immediately, contact my supervisor, call in a team of wildlife biologists, alert the proper authorities. But I could already imagine how that conversation would unfold. Game wardens who reported zombie Bigfoot sightings didn't tend to keep their jobs very long, regardless of how much photographic evidence they brought to the table. There was also the question of public safety. If this thing posed a genuine threat to hikers or hunters, I had a duty to warn people. But how do you issue a warning about something that shouldn't exist? How do you tell people to avoid an area because it's inhabited by a decomposing cryptid without causing mass panic or becoming the subject of ridicule? I thought about Dr. Whitmore at the university. She might be willing to examine my photos and evidence, to offer a scientific perspective on what I documented. But even she would struggle to explain how something in that state of decay could continue functioning. The radio crackled to life, interrupting my thoughts. Dispatch was calling all units about a missing hiker in the Glacier National Park area, about 60 miles north of my current location. An experienced outdoorsman had failed to return from a solo camping trip, and search and rescue teams were being organized. For a moment, I felt a chill of possibility. Could there be a connection? Could the creature I'd been tracking have expanded its range, moved into areas where it might encounter unsuspecting humans? The timing could be coincidental, but the location was troubling close to known Bigfoot sighting areas. I keyed the radio to volunteer for the search operation, but then hesitated. If I was right about the connection, I'd be sending search teams into potential danger without warning them about what they might encounter. But if I was wrong, I'd be wasting resources and time that could mean the difference between life and death for the missing hiker. In the end, I made the decision that would change everything. I couldn't risk other people encountering what I'd seen without warning them first, but I also couldn't file an official report about zombie Bigfoot. The solution was to find someone I trusted, someone with enough experience and credibility to handle the information appropriately. I called Bobby Kowalski. "Hey, Vince," he answered on the second ring. "Heard you called in sick the other day. Everything okay?" "Bobby, I need to talk to you about what happened at that poaching scene. Can you meet me somewhere private?" There was a pause. "This about that scare you had in the woods?" "It's about a lot more than that. Can you meet me at Murphy's Bar in an hour?" "Sure, kid. I'll be there." Murphy's Bar was a local establishment popular with law enforcement and emergency services personnel. It was the kind of place where off-duty cops and rangers could drink beer and trade stories without worrying about civilian oversight. More importantly, it had a back room that afforded privacy for sensitive conversations. Bobby was already there when I arrived, nursing a beer and looking concerned. He was still in uniform, having come directly from his shift. I bought a beer for myself and gestured toward the back room. "This is that kind of conversation?" he asked. "Yeah, it really is." We settled into a corner booth where we couldn't be overheard. I pulled out my camera and set it on the table between us. "Bobby, I need you to listen to what I'm about to tell you with an open mind. And I need you to look at these photos before you decide I've lost my sanity." For the next 30 minutes, I told him everything, the blood trail that led to something impossible, the creature I'd witnessed shambling through the forest, the nest I'd discovered, and the evidence I'd collected. Bobby listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he reached for the camera and began scrolling through the photos. His face remained carefully neutral as he examined the tracks, the nest, the bones scattered around the clearing. "These tracks," he said finally. "You're sure they're real?" "I watched it make them, Bobby. I saw that thing walking on the stump of its ankle bone. And the smell you described? Worse than anything I've ever encountered. Worse than that week-old car accident victim we found 2 summers ago." Bobby continued studying the photos, zooming in on details and examining them from different angles. His 23 years of experience had taught him to read sign and evaluate evidence with scientific precision. I knew he was looking for signs of manipulation or hoax, anything that might explain what he was seeing in rational terms. "The bone damage," he said, pointing to one of the photos. "Those tooth marks are too big for any predator in this region." "That's what I thought too." "And you said this thing was definitely dead, not just diseased or injured." "Bobby, I've seen plenty of injured animals. This wasn't injury. Half its abdomen was missing. It was walking around with its intestines hanging out of its body." He set the camera down and looked at me directly. "Vince, in 23 years of doing this job, I've seen things that don't make it into official reports, things that don't fit into neat categories or scientific explanations. But this, I know how it sounds. Do you? Because what you're describing challenges everything we understand about life and death. You're talking about something that should be impossible. But you believe me." Bobby was quiet for another long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I believe you saw something, and these photos, they're evidence of something that shouldn't exist. The question is what we do about it." Bobby and I spent the next 2 hours developing a plan. We couldn't file an official report. Not yet anyway. But we also couldn't ignore the potential threat to public safety. Our solution was to create an unofficial watch on the area, monitoring it for signs of the creature while documenting everything we found. Bobby had contacts at the state university, people who might be willing to examine our evidence confidentially. He also knew search and rescue coordinators, who could be quietly warned to exercise extra caution in certain areas without being told exactly why. We agreed to return to the site together the following week, this time with better equipment and backup protocols. If the creature was still there, we'd attempt to gather more comprehensive evidence. If it had moved on, we'd try to track its path and predict where it might go next. But fate had other plans. 2 days later, Bobby called me at 6 in the morning. His voice was grim and urgent. "Vince, we've got a problem. They found the missing hiker. Dead? Worse, turn on the news." I fumbled for the television remote, my heart already racing. The local morning news was leading with the story. A search and rescue team had found the missing hiker's remains in a remote area of Glacier National Park. The reporter's description of the scene made my blood run cold. The body had been discovered in a condition that defied explanation. According to the medical examiner's preliminary report, the victim showed signs of predation by an unknown animal, but the damage was unlike anything documented in North American wildlife attacks. The bite marks were too large, the pattern of injury too extensive for any known predator. More disturbing was the state of the campsite. The hiker's gear had been scattered across a wide area, as if something had investigated each item individually before discarding it. Personal belongings were mixed with organic debris in a pattern that reminded investigators of nest-building behavior. But it was the final detail that confirmed my worst fears. The reporter mentioned that search teams had found unusual tracks at the scene, enormous footprints that didn't match any cataloged North American wildlife. The tracks showed evidence of some kind of injury or deformity to the right foot. I called Bobby back immediately. "It moved north. Looks that way. The timing fits with when you last saw it." "Bobby, we have to do something. This thing killed someone." "I know. I'm already making calls. Give me 2 hours, then meet me at the ranger station." When I arrived at the ranger station, Bobby had assembled a small group of people I'd never seen before. They included Dr. Sandra Whitmore from the university, whom I'd interviewed about prion diseases, and 2 other individuals who introduced themselves only by first names, presumably federal agents of some kind. "Ranger Russo," Dr. Whitmore said as I entered the conference room. "Ranger Kowalski has shared some very interesting photographs with us." The atmosphere in the room was tense but professional. These people were clearly taking the situation seriously, which was both reassuring and terrifying. If federal agents were involved, it meant that what I'd discovered had implications beyond simple wildlife management. One of the agents, a woman who looked to be in her 40s with prematurely gray hair, spoke first. "We need you to understand that everything discussed in this room is classified. You'll be signing documentation to that effect before you leave." "What kind of documentation?" I asked. "The kind that ensures this conversation never happened," the other agent replied. He was younger, with a kind of rigid posture that suggested military background, at least as far as public record is concerned. Dr. Whitmore leaned forward. "Ranger Russo, what you've documented appears to be related to a biological phenomenon we've been tracking for several years. This isn't the first incident of its kind. There are others, isolated cases scattered across multiple states, always in remote wilderness areas, always involving what witnesses describe as impossible creatures that appear to be both dead and mobile." The female agent pulled out a file folder and removed several photographs. They showed tracks similar to what I documented, along with images of disturbed campsites and scattered remains. We've been calling them Class D entities. The designation stands for deceased locomotive. "You mean there are multiple zombie Bigfoot creatures wandering around?" "We don't use that terminology," the male agent said sharply. "But yes, there appear to be several entities exhibiting similar characteristics. The one you encountered appears to be the most advanced case we've documented. Dr. Whitmore spread out additional papers on the table. We believe these entities are the result of an unknown pathogen, something that can reanimate deceased tissue while maintaining basic motor functions. It's unlike any disease process we've previously encountered. Are they dangerous? The Glacier Park incident suggests they can be, the female agent replied. Previous encounters have been limited to livestock predation and property damage. This is the first confirmed human fatality. Bobby had been quiet throughout the exchange, but now he spoke up. What do you need from us? Continued monitoring and documentation, Dr. Whitmore said. If the entity returns to the area where Ranger Russo first encountered it, we need to know immediately. We're assembling a response team, but we need real-time intelligence. The male agent handed me a secure satellite phone. This connects directly to our operations center. If you see the entity again, call immediately. Don't attempt to approach or interact with it under any circumstances. What happens when you catch it? That's classified, the female agent said. But we can tell you that public safety is our primary concern. These entities represent a potential threat that must be contained. As we prepared to leave the meeting, Dr. Whitmore pulled me aside. Ranger Russo, I want you to understand the significance of what you've documented. This could represent a completely new form of post-mortem biological activity. The scientific implications are staggering, and the public safety implications are equally significant. If this pathogen can affect one unknown hominid species, there's no telling what else it might be capable of. We need to understand it before it spreads. Driving home that evening, I found myself looking at the Montana wilderness with completely different eyes. The forests I'd spent my career protecting now seemed to harbor secrets that challenged the very foundations of biological science. Somewhere out there, something that should have been dead was continuing to move, to hunt, to exist in defiance of natural law. The secure phone sat on my passenger seat, a tangible reminder that my life had changed forever. I was no longer just a game warden. I was part of a classified operation dealing with threats that existed beyond public knowledge or understanding. 3 weeks later, I was shot by a drunk poacher during an unrelated incident. The bullet shattered my left shoulder and ended my career as a field ranger. During my recovery, I received word through unofficial channels that the entity I'd encountered had been contained by the federal response team. I never learned exactly what that meant. Now, 5 years later, I work as a civilian consultant for the state wildlife department, mostly desk work and training new rangers. I've never spoken publicly about what I witnessed in those woods, and I never will. The classification agreements I signed ensure that, but sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder how many other impossible things are wandering through the American wilderness. How many other creatures that shouldn't exist are living in the spaces between what science understands and what nature allows. I hope I never find out, but I also hope that if someone else encounters what I did, they'll have the courage to document it, to report it, to ensure that the proper authorities are alerted. Because if there's one thing I learned from my experience, it's that the world contains horrors we're not prepared to acknowledge, and ignoring them doesn't make them go away. My name is George Wallace, and I am 68 years old. This is a true story about something that happened to me a few years back when I was working as a park ranger at Sleeping Giant State Park in Connecticut. I had been a ranger for nearly 20 years at that point, and I thought I'd seen it all, but nothing prepared me for what happened that autumn. It was a chilly October evening, and I had just finished a long day of patrolling the trails and making sure the campgrounds were clear of litter. The park was quiet as it usually was this time of year, with only a few campers braving the cold nights. I was looking forward to a warm meal and maybe a beer or two before heading to bed. Around 8 p.m. I got a call on my radio. It was Sarah, one of the newer rangers. She sounded panicked, her voice shaky. She told me there was something weird going on at the northwest edge of the park, near the old quarry. Sarah was usually level-headed, so her distress worried me. I grabbed my flashlight, radio, and my old Glock 19 just in case. I drove my Jeep through the winding park roads, the headlights cutting through the dense fog that had settled in. I could see the old quarry silhouette in the distance, a gaping wound in the side of the mountain. As I got closer, I noticed Sarah's Jeep parked haphazardly on the side of the road. Its lights still on, but Sarah was nowhere to be seen. I called out for her, but there was no response. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I started to get a bad feeling in my gut. I decided to check the quarry, thinking maybe Sarah had gone inside to investigate something. The place had a reputation for being dangerous, especially at night. As I approached the entrance to the quarry, I noticed something odd. There were strange markings on the ground, like someone had been dragging something heavy. The marks led into the quarry, and despite every instinct telling me to turn back, I followed them. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of moss and wet stone. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the rocky walls. I called out again, louder this time. "Sarah, you in here?" No answer. No answer. I moved deeper into the quarry, my hand on my gun. The dragging marks led to a narrow crevice in the rock face, a place I had never noticed before. The opening was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed forward. The crevice opened up into a small cavern. The air here was different, colder, and with a strange metallic smell. My flashlight beam caught something reflective on the far wall. As I moved closer, I realized it was some kind of symbol etched into the rock. It looked ancient, a series of interlocking circles and lines that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I heard a faint noise, like a whimper, coming from deeper in the cave. I moved forward cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I rounded a corner, I saw Sarah huddled against the wall, her eyes wide with terror. "George, thank God," she croaked. "We need to get out of here, now." I was about to ask her what happened when I heard another sound, this one much closer. It was a low guttural noise, almost like an animal growling, but with an unnatural metallic edge to it. I spun around, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the shadows was a figure, tall and humanoid, but with features that were all wrong. Its skin seemed to shift and ripple, sometimes looking like polished metal, other times like rough stone. Its eyes glowed with an eerie blue light, and where its mouth should have been, there was only a dark void. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I fired my gun, the noise deafening in the confined space. The creature let out a shriek that sounded like grinding metal and lunged at me. I dodged to the side and fired again, this time hitting it square in the chest. It staggered back but didn't fall. Instead, it seemed to dissolve into the shadows, disappearing from sight. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed Sarah and we ran, stumbling through the dark cave and out into the quarry. The fog had thickened, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. We made it to my Jeep, and I practically threw Sarah into the passenger seat before jumping in myself. I floored it, driving as fast as I dared through the winding park roads. Back at the ranger station, I called for an ambulance and tried to get Sarah to tell me what happened. Between gasps for breath, she told me she had seen strange lights in the quarry and went to investigate. That's when she encountered the creature. It had chased her into the cave where she had hidden until I found her. The ambulance arrived, and they took Sarah to the hospital. I filed my report, but I knew no one would believe the truth. I barely believed it myself. Over the next few days, I searched the park for any signs of the creature but found nothing. It was like it had vanished into thin air. Sarah recovered from her injuries, but she was never the same. She left the Park Service and moved to a different state, wanting to put as much distance between herself and Sleeping Giant as possible. I stayed on, but I was more cautious, always looking over my shoulder, always listening for that strange metallic sound. I never saw the creature again, but every time I passed the old quarry, I felt its presence lurking just out of sight. I started calling it the Stone Shifter, a name that seemed to fit. I did some research and found old stories, legends about strange beings that lived in the mountains, neither fully flesh nor stone. Most people dismissed them as myths, but I knew better. About a year later, I was patrolling the park when I saw a light in the distance. It was coming from the direction of the quarry. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I hadn't been back there since that night with Sarah, but something compelled me to go now. I drove as close as I could and then continued on foot, moving quietly through the trees. The light was still there, a strange pulsing blue glow. As I got closer, I saw a figure standing near the entrance to the quarry. It was an old man, his face weathered and lined, his eyes fixed on the glowing symbol I had seen in the cave. The symbol was now visible on the rock face outside, pulsing with that eerie blue light. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked into the quarry. I followed, my hand on my gun. Inside, the air was charged with a strange energy that made my skin tingle. The old man was standing by the crevice that led to the cave, looking into it with a mixture of fear and longing. "Sir, are you okay?" I asked, my voice echoing in the empty space. He turned to look at me, and I saw his eyes were the same glowing blue as the symbol. "They're coming back," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "The old ones are waking up." Before I could respond, there was a flash of blue light, and the old man was gone. In his place stood the stone shifter, its form rippling and changing in the pulsing light. It reached out towards me with a hand that was sometimes flesh, sometimes stone, sometimes living metal. I backed away, my heart racing. I knew I was facing something beyond my understanding, something that had been here long before humans and would likely be here long after we were gone. The stone shifter didn't advance. Instead, it seemed to be waiting, watching. I left the quarry that night and never went back. I continued working as a ranger until my retirement, but I avoided that part of the park and I made sure others did too. The stone shifter and the mystery of the glowing symbol remained unexplained, and I was content to keep it that way. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right, I can hear a faint, metallic whisper carried on the breeze, and I wonder what ancient secrets are still sleeping in the heart of the mountain, waiting to wake up.